I'm going to take it down more into the kind of the nuts and bolts level. If you are responsible for actually presenting content to the user, what are the techniques that we can use? All right, so the big picture, we'll talk about responsive design, which is kind of the industry term for how do we have our content adapt to whatever device a customer is using. We'll look at the role of content structure, CSS, and media queries, and then we'll look at some responsive design strategies. Ignore the bottom two, we probably won't have time for those. All right, so what is responsive design? Well, it's really just a fancy new name for the ability for your content to adapt to whatever the customer's device happens to be. So it's a concept that was first described by a web designer named Ethan Marcotte. Now, this is a white paper that was written a few years ago, but it is still available on the web. And it's a design concept that was created to address what Ethan called stress points. Now, that language has changed. Most people refer to it as break points now. But where it really came from is, go backwards in time 5 or 6 years, and a lot of web designers would build a beautiful web page. And then 6 months later, the customer would come back and say, okay, well, now we need a version for the iPhone. And they'd build another version of the web page. There'd be the main web page, and there'd be the iPhone web page. Well, then a year later, the customer would come back and say, well, now we need the iPad web page. And they would build a third. So now they kept duplicating their web page for all these different devices. Well, that's kind of where responsive design comes from. How do we write content once and let it self-adapt to these various devices? But first, what responsive design is not. There's a lot of misunderstanding. It's not a smaller version of your main page. How many of you have ever tried to use your smartphone to go to a web page and it's microscopic? That is not responsive design. If you have to zoom and pinch and zoom and that's not proper responsive design. The other problem, removing content to fit. You shouldn't have to get half of a page just because you're on a smartphone. The whole idea is you should get the information you need no matter what device you're using. And we don't want a separate version of our page for each and every device. That's the whole reason for responsive design, is to avoid that problem. Now, the problem that I found trying to put this presentation together, this is a young enough concept, I didn't find a very good definition. So if you disagree with this definition, feel free to argue with me after the session. But this is Mike's definition. Responsive design is a single version of your content delivered to your customer in a way that is easily understood no matter what device they are using. Whether it be a large television, a small watch, a smartphone, a tablet, if the customer gets the information they need, it worked. Now, the problem with this, if you work for a company that has one of those marketing departments that wants to control every last millimeter of space, and they want to have the design handbook, the design handbook kind of goes out the window now, because this content will appear differently, potentially, for every customer. So the goal is less on fitting a corporate style guide, and it's more about getting the customer the content they need. So core components of responsive design, and this goes beautifully with the previous presentation. As was mentioned, we have to separate content from formatting. That's always been a goal, but if you're going to do responsive design, it's critical. So the core components are the document structure itself, the proper use of style sheets, and then a new technology that's part of the CSS3 specification, the use of media queries. Now, we're not going to go deep into media queries as far as like code or anything like that. I just want to give you some high-level concepts. But when it comes to document structure, in responsive design, less is more, as they would say. In other words, keep the formatting out of the core document. We want content, nothing but content. And here's an example I like to use. Everybody realizes we shouldn't have inline formatting on text, but there's a lot more to keeping presentation out of your documents. And I'm sure nobody in this room is guilty of this, but a lot of techniques from the old Microsoft Word days were, if I wanted 5 images with a layout like this, people would usually insert a sneaky hidden table that was 2 rows, 3 columns, and they would make the table invisible, and they would put each graphic in a table cell. Well, in a Microsoft Word document, you can do that. The problem now is when I try to adapt this to a smartphone, the whole thing blows up. So separating content from formatting is a lot more than just avoiding making text bold. That means no hidden tables, no hidden formatting of any kind. Other things to avoid: fixed div containers, fixed size images, any inline formatting or sizing. All right, so that's the structure part. Now we get into the style sheet. And the second leg of the responsive design stool is the style sheet itself. We want all look, feel, and formatting in the style sheet. And that's beyond text. It's not what font, what color. It's the entire layout of the page. So all of my block level elements, my textual elements, yes, they will be controlled. But also my character level elements, if I want a title to be bold, that should be in the style sheet. But the most important, any of my grouping or design information should also be in the style sheet, not in the core document. So if this is the topic that I start with, a lot of people look at that and say, well, my gosh, that's what the web looked like 20 years ago. I thought we moved past that. Well, this is perfect for responsive design. This is a topic where all of the formatting has been separated. Now, when I apply the block level formatting, the paragraphs and the heading, well, again, this was all controlled from the style sheet. If I need any character formatting, again, this should be applied from the style sheet. But most importantly, if I want that image with a caption to have special formatting, it should be wrapped in a div element and controlled from the style sheet. So everything you see here, none of that formatting is in the core page. It's all style sheet driven. And that brings us to the final or new component, the media queries. Now, if you've used CSS2 or older, we've always had the ability to use what were known as media types. I could have one style sheet that renders content one way in print and a different way in the web browser. And that was okay, but the World Wide Web Consortium realized that didn't go far enough. So media queries are now part of the CSS3 specification, derived from those media types, but where in the old days I could say @media screen, and I could say, okay, I want all of my text to be black, and I want it to be Verdana. Well, then I could say @media print, I want my text to be black, but I want it to be Times New Roman in print. So this way I could have one style sheet, and yet it would render the same content in a way that was optimized for 2 different formats. Well, the problem with that how many different screen types are there? There are smartphones, there are small tablets, there are large tablets, there are computer desktops, there's big screens, there's projectors. So having one type of screen just didn't work. And then on print, well, how many different print sizes might you have to produce? You might have to do a full-size bound manual. You might have to do a job aid as a card. You might have to do a small pamphlet that goes in a DVD case. So again, the media type of print, it was just too limiting. So media types went on to become media queries. And here is where we can actually allow you to test the parameters of the viewing or display device. Based on the results, we can actually adjust the presentation of that content in real time. And I said I wasn't going to throw a bunch of code up there. I fibbed a little bit. This is one example. But what I've done here is it says, let's see if I can figure out the pointer. Okay, so at media screen, so this means we're looking at screen type devices. We're looking at glass. But max width, 480 pixels. So that's a very narrow screen. Body, background color, yellow. So if I have a small screen, I want the background of my page to be yellow. But then in the same style sheet, I can say, well, if I have a minimum width of 481 pixels and a maximum width of 650 pixels, well, then I want the background to be red. So if it's a small screen, it's yellow. If it's a medium screen, it's red. And then I can say if it's a minimum width of 651 or if it's a large screen, I want the background to be green. So now we have one style sheet, 3 different media queries, and I just used background color as an example because it's easy to see, but I could change any presentation in the entire page based on the size of the screen that you're viewing. So if it's a small screen, the background will be yellow. If it's a medium screen, the background will be red. And if it's a large screen, the background will be green automatically. And the nice thing is, as the writer, I might not even know this in advance. This style sheet could be added at any point in the future. And if we find out that we have a 4th size, we could just add a 4th media query. So anything on screen could be controlled. All right, so what can media queries test? That last example was very basic. I was just looking at the width of the screen in pixels. That was how a lot of responsive design was done in the beginning, but you can't trust it anymore. How many people here have a nice brand new fancy iPhone? Oh, somebody must have a fancy iPhone. You're just too shy. Okay. The problem with the new Retina displays, they have a higher resolution than most desktop computer monitors. So if you just check for pixels, sometimes you'll get bad results. So other things that we can test for, well, the width and height of the display area, the width and height of the device itself. You can actually test for orientation. You can tell if a tablet is in landscape or portrait mode. And you can check for aspect ratio. And then my favorite, pixel density. So now I can say, okay, how many pixels wide is the screen? But more importantly, how many pixels per centimeter? And that way I will know, well, is this a very tiny screen or a very large screen? So lots of things that we can test for. Now, responsive design strategies. This has changed a lot in a very short period of time. The concept now is no longer think of things like headings and paragraphs, but almost think like somebody publishing a newspaper used to. You think about columns, sections. You know, is it the business section? Is it the society section? And think of each of those areas as almost a grid element, because we want to control those elements. So instead of thinking of just individual headers and paragraphs, in this case, we have a main header area, content section 1, content section 2, and content section 3. This might be the presentation that I want on my website, but that's not going to fit on a tablet, and that's not going to fit on a smartphone. But by treating these as separate content areas, we can use one of those media queries to reflow these major areas. So if this does get rendered on a tablet that's in portrait mode, well, maybe I then have the header at the top, content 1, back. If content 1 is my major area, I want it full width, but then content 2 and content 3 can share the width of the tablet. And then if this gets rendered on a smartphone with a very narrow screen, well, maybe I want all of my main content areas to just stack up. Having the ability to do this means we have to write the content correctly and keep the formatting out of it. All right, so what Ethan talked about as stress points, I mentioned those have become known as breakpoints. When you control when that grid changes is based on this concept of breakpoints. The problem with breakpoints is when responsive design first started, what were the default breakpoints? Well, let's see. I want web mode, and then what's the resolution of an iPad? Okay, that's when we go into tablet mode. What's the resolution of an iPhone? Okay, that's when we go into telephone mode. That failed horribly. And the reason it ended up failing, it made sense in the beginning, but the reason it failed is when you start chasing physical devices, well, look at all the devices we have to chase now. There were just too many different resolutions, too many different devices. It just became impossible, especially, as I said, with the Apple Retina displays. They now have higher resolution than most desktop computers. So if we can't chase hardware, what is the best strategy? Well, first, determine the minimum and maximum sizes you need to support, and then load your own content, and then slowly start to resize your browser window. Your content's going to look good, it looks good, it looks good, and all of a sudden, boom, okay, my content doesn't look so good anymore. The side of the browser is starting to cover up the company logo, something is going wrong. That will be your first breakpoint. And a lot of people, when they talk about responsive design, they talk about web browser size, tablet size, and smartphone size. I hate those terms. Think of it as large, medium, and small. So we want to run in large mode as long as your content looks good. As soon as your content doesn't look good, then we want to switch to our next flow of content, which would be medium. Then we'll resize the browser again until our content doesn't look good anymore, and then we'll resize to small. Now, the reason I like small, medium, and large is, again, it could be on watches, it could be on an embedded screen in a refrigerator. This whole idea of desktop, tablet, phone, it's just becoming a bit obsolete when it's only 2 years old. All right, so we're almost down to the end. So summary, the core components of responsive design, we talked about those. Document structure is key, and we absolutely have to keep the formatting out of the content. And again, that's not just inline styles. That's the hidden tables or any kind of forced formatting we might apply. CSS is critical for styling our documents, but then the new part of CSS are those media queries. And that's the secret sauce. I can actually, based on the physical device, alter the flow and presentation of any aspect of the page. Then we talked about the strategies. The original strategy was to chase physical hardware, those resolution sizes. We talked about how there's just too many devices now. It's turned out to be a much better strategy to model on your own content and determine your breakpoints on your content. All right. And actually, I trimmed too many slides because they told me I had a limited amount of time, but that means we have more time for questions. And I went way too fast and put everybody into an after-lunch coma.
Yes, okay, we've got one question. And some soap waiting for the...
Hi there, and thanks for the presentation. My question is, how do you actually deal with different levels of browser support for different CSS elements?
How do we deal with different browser element support? Well, the good news, it's nowhere near as horrible as it was back in the 1990s. Almost all modern browsers have CSS3 support these days, so it's not nearly the nightmare that it used to be. Now, there are places where you can get into a little bit of trouble, but that's more content than on the implementation of responsive design. One of the tricky areas that was supposed to be fixed is still video. One of the big dreams of HTML5 is, video would now just play in every browser, and one of the browsers goofed that up like usual. It wasn't Internet Explorer this time. It was Google Chrome. So now MP4 works in all browsers except Google Chrome, which requires the WebM format. But I'm getting off track. So back to a responsive design point of view, well, the good news is 90% of responsive design is fully supported across all the browsers. Now, the one place that is tricky, and this is actually not so much a flaw in the browsers as it is in the CSS3 spec, and the W3C has already admitted this and they're working on a solution. We're very good at being able to detect physical sizes, devices. What we can't reliably detect right now is a touch interface versus a mouse interface, or what they officially call low resolution versus high resolution interaction devices. And the reason that got goofed up a little bit is the CSS call that tests, is this a touch device, doesn't call the hardware, it calls the browser. And of course, every browser says, well, of course, I'm touch friendly. Now the device I'm running on isn't, but I am. So you actually get a false positive if you try to test for a touch interface. But that's the only one issue I'm aware of that's kind of widespread. Much longer answer than you probably expected.
That was okay. And may I have another one? Well, what if you're trying to be, web standards compliant and all modern, and you're using responsive design, but your clients are still using Internet Explorer 7 or 8? So are you an advocate of actually cutting them off from your website and forcing them to update their browsers? And what if they actually cannot update their browsers because, let's say, they're still using Windows XP, which is probably unlikely, but you know where I'm getting at.
Yeah, so basically, what if a customer refuses to join the modern world? They're still using Netscape Navigator Gold 2.0. No, I'm kidding. They're still using Internet Explorer 7. That's one of those cases where you have to be sensitive to the customer. And as much as we'd like to say we don't want to do this, that might be a case where you might actually have to have not, 8 versions of your site, but you might have, okay, here's the modern version with responsive design, and then here's the backwards compatible version. That makes me cringe a little bit to even admit that, but sometimes we have to do things we don't like for certain customers. My general rule at our company, we won't support a browser after Microsoft stops supporting that browser. So we've been able to cut off IE7, and we still kind of look funny at IE8. But even IE8, it's not fully responsive, but it's doggone close. There's a lot of things that still work in IE8.
Thanks.
Any more questions? We still have time for questions.
I don't have a question, but rather a comment, because you said that most of users using the newest browsers, but I would say that it depends on the country you use, because probably in India there are much more percentage of EA7, EA8 than in Europe and than in US.
True, you have to know your audience. That is a given.
Okay, and I have a question here. Could you explain for a non-designer like me, I know two terms used together, responsive design and adaptive design. Could you explain, are they the same or what is the difference just in simple terms? Thanks.
Responsive design and adaptive design. And we can throw in another one, fluid design. There have been various terms over the years. In my opinion, the big difference is fluid design, which later became adaptive design, was primarily talking about different resolutions of desktop computers. Responsive design is kind of formalizing that into tablets and smartphones as well. So to me, it's just a continuation of the concepts of adaptive design and fluid design before that.
Any other questions?
Hello. A simple question about the future. So things are evolving very quickly. The whole standard is pretty new. We got used to this C language for Macs. Now we have Swift. Then there's new R language and so on and so on. So being rooted into responsive design, do you see there any new space for another language or meta language or anything that would, I can imagine how CSS3 would look like in 2 years. And I predict there will be something more. Can you see it already? What's to be there?
Can I see room for a new style language in the future? I would hope not. We've had CSS for, upwards of 10 years now. It has evolved, version 1, 2, and 3. The World Wide Web Consortium did make an announcement about 18 months ago. They are going to stop with the version numbers. It's just going to be more iterative updates now. So we will see what people were expecting to be CSS4. It just won't be called that. They're going to slowly be updating the specs for the CSS3 properties and commands. So this will evolve and get better over time. The question is, how quickly the browser vendors will follow any of the updates made by the World Wide Web Consortium. Do I see room for a whole new language? That would have to be really compelling because there's so much of the world invested in the CSS technology. Personal opinion.
Yeah, so probably the part 2 would be when we deal with devices and everything, and it's okay, but then we will have problem with, does this browser support this feature? I don't know if you would know what I mean. Is then you will have to, okay, if this is, we had this in JavaScript on early days, like if you're on IE6, do this, but if you're on IE7, do that. Are you not afraid that it will go that way? That soon your CSS3 will look like, okay, if you're on a screen that's at least 6 inches and it has at least 600 pixels and supports this and supports that, then do this. I know how code is quickly written and how it quickly becomes a nightmare. So that's why in programming languages we have frameworks evolving really quickly. I don't see there any space for frameworks, and as an ex-programmer, I can see this scary a little bit. It doesn't scale too much for me.
The good news is as long as we're talking IE9 or newer, or any common modern version of Chrome, Safari, Firefox, or Opera, they all fully support responsive design now. So that's the good news. As far as non-standard devices, I haven't run into any major problems. Some of the most bizarre devices I've run into is I've worked with the mining authority down in Australia. They actually have these little, it's almost like I don't want to call it a gun, but they use it for like reading barcodes, but it also has a little computer screen in it. That adapts. It turns out I don't even know what micro browser is in it, but I believe it's running a copy of Linux. So I have seen some very strange devices, and responsive design has still worked on those. So I have high hopes, but I test a lot.
Anyone else? That would be the last question. Okay.
Hi, I just wanted to ask something about responsive design and image resizing. Ideally on a large screen, imagine if your web page is very image heavy and maybe you're running images there which are 800 by 400. When it comes down to resizing them, is there any way of avoiding longer load speeds on a smaller device? Because I imagine it's just going to resize the same large image.
So question was load times when using CSS techniques on images. I was really trying not to talk about products.
Sorry.
Some of that depends. If you're just following the spec natively, then a lot of times it's going to be one image that does get resized, and that could be a fairly long load time if it's a small device. A lot of the tools out there, I know ours does it at MadCap, I'm sure some of the others, we have some options. If you're enabling responsive design, we can pre-compile different sizes that are then optimized for different devices. Now, the trade-off, it will take up more space on the server, but the benefit is for the customer, they get much lower load times then. So some of that depends on what tools you're using and kind of what technology choices you've made. But it can be optimized.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you a lot. Thank you, Mike, for helping us out, for being with us, for a great presentation. A big applause for Mike.